Silverleaf Estate, October 14th. The sun is setting over a manicured lawn that cost more than my yearly salary. I am sitting in the shadows of the overflow lot, gripping a heavy manila envelope until my knuckles turn white. My name is Lois Dixon, and inside the lodge my family is drinking champagne paid for with my stolen inheritance. They think I am the villain, the difficult daughter who was sent away to keep the peace. But the peace was a lie, and the money was never theirs. I didn't come to ruin a wedding. I came to reclaim the truth, even if I have to burn their perfect day to the ground to find it. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The engine of my rental car ticked as it cooled a rhythmic metallic sound that seemed too loud in the quiet of the employee overflow lot. From where I sat, slumped low in the driver's seat of a gray sedan that smelled faintly of stale pine air freshener and other people's choices, I had a perfect view of the Silverleaf Estate. It was the kind of venue that didn't just whisper wealth, it shouted it in a refined mid-Atlantic accent. The main lodge was a sprawling historic masterpiece of limestone and ivy fronted by a lawn so manicured it looked like it had been cut with cuticle scissors. Valets in crisp white jackets were jogging back and forth under the portico, parking luxury SUVs and vintage convertibles, while the faint, sweet strains of a string quartet drifted on the wind. They were playing Pachelbel's Canon. Of course they were. It was a perfect day for a wedding. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue, the kind of backdrop photographers prayed for. Inside that lodge, my sister Hannah was getting her hair finished. My mother was probably terrorizing a florist about the shade of the hydrangeas, and my father was likely nursing a scotch, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned the color of old parchment. On the passenger seat beside me lay a thick manila envelope and a heavy, tarnished brass key. They were the only weapons I had brought. I didn't come here to ruin a wedding. That's what they would say later when the tears started and the mascara ran. They would say Lois was bitter. Lois was jealous. Lois, the black sheep, the difficult one, just couldn't stand to let anyone else be happy. But that wasn't it. I hadn't driven 300 miles to cause a scene. I came to stop a lie from becoming permanent. By the time I stood up to speak, my mother's smile was going to look less like a benediction and more like a threat. To understand why I was sitting in a rental car clutching a packet of legal documents instead of sipping champagne in the bridal suite, you have to go back to the beginning. Or at least the beginning of the end of my place in the Dixon family. I was 12 years old when I learned that love was conditional. I remember the sound of the zipper on my duffel bag, a sharp, tearing noise that seemed to rip through the silence of the hallway. My mother, Marianne, stood by the front door. She wasn't crying. She was checking her lipstick in the hall mirror, pressing her lips together to even out the shade. "It's not forever, Lois," she had said, her voice airy and detached, as if she were discussing a dry-cleaning drop-off rather than her daughter. "You're just difficult. You make things hard for the family. You need structure your father and I can't provide right now." That was the narrative. I was difficult. I was troubled. They never explained what the family incident was that necessitated my removal, mostly because there wasn't one. I was just loud, observant, and unwilling to play the prop in Marianne's perfect suburban tableau. I wasn't fostered. That would have been too public, too messy for the Dixon reputation. I was sent away to live with an aunt 3 states away. Aunt Sarah, a woman who smoked Virginia Slims indoors, and looked at me like I was a stray cat. She was obligated to feed but didn't have to pet. I learned the great American lesson earlier than most. Self-reliance isn't a virtue you choose. It's a survival mechanism you build when the safety net is cut. I worked 2 jobs through high school. I paid for my own community college classes in cash, counting out crumpled 1s and 5s at the bursar's office because I didn't have a credit card. I built a stable life. It was a small life, a studio apartment with reliable heat, a used Honda, and a job as a paralegal, where being obsessive about details was an asset, not a flaw, but it was mine. I didn't owe the Dixons a dime, and for the most part, they were happy to pretend I didn't exist. There was only one exception: Nana Ruth. My grandmother, my father's mother, was the only person in the bloodline who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a problem to be managed. Even after I was sent away, she showed up. She sent birthday cards every year, the envelopes thick and smelling of lavender with $20 bills tucked inside. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the notes. In her spidery, shaking cursive, she wrote things that felt like oxygen to a drowning girl. Saw a girl in the paper who won a debate prize, and she looked just like you. Keep fighting low. She called me on Sundays, her voice raspy from years of refusing to quit cigarettes until her 80s. She would tell me stories about the family that my parents had sanitized: the failures, the struggles, the humanity. Nana Ruth valued three things above all else: resilience, fairness, and personal freedom. "No one owns you, Lois," she told me once when I was 19 and crying over a missed Christmas invitation I knew was never coming. "Not even blood, especially not blood. You belong to yourself." She was my anchor. She was the proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't unlovable. And when she passed away 6 months ago, the anchor line snapped. The aftermath of her death was strange. The silence from my parents, usually a comforting void, was suddenly filled with a frantic, artificial warmth. My mother called me twice in 1 week. My father sent a text asking about my car. It felt slimy, like walking through a spiderweb in the dark. I sensed it immediately. This wasn't grief. This was anxiety. Marianne Dixon didn't do charity, and she certainly didn't do apologies. She did transactions. I didn't understand the angle until the wedding invitation arrived. It was a heavy square of cream cardstock with gold foil lettering that caught the light. "Hannah Marie Dixon and Evan James Miller request the honor of your presence." It must have cost $10 just to mail it. Inside, tucked against the RSVP card, was a handwritten note from Mom. It didn't say, "We miss you." It didn't say, "Please come home." It read, "We'd love you there if you can keep things peaceful." A day later, a follow-up text buzzed on my phone. "Don't embarrass us, Lois. This is Hannah's day. Just be normal for once." I sat at my kitchen table staring at that invite. I should have thrown it out. I should have burned it and gone on with my quiet, independent life. But something nagged at me. The venue. Silverleaf. I knew Silverleaf because in my line of work I handled contracts for high-net-worth clients. I knew that a Saturday buyout at Silverleaf was a 6-figure commitment. The venue fee alone was more than my annual salary. And that didn't include the catering, the band, the florals, or the open bar. The math didn't work. My father managed a hardware store. My mother was a part-time interior decorator who spent more than she earned trying to look the part. Hannah was a 3rd-grade teacher. Evan, the fiancé, was a decent guy from a respectable family, but he was a junior associate at an architecture firm drowning in student loans. Comfortable. Sure. Silverleaf comfortable. Absolutely not. Unless they had come into a windfall. My stomach turned over. I thought of Nana Ruth. In our last few calls, she had been lucid, sharp as a tack despite her failing body. She had hinted more than once that she had set things up for me. "I've taken care of it," she'd whispered into the phone, her voice conspiring. "You won't have to scrape forever, Lo. I made sure of it." But when she died, there was nothing. Dad had mentioned a small insurance policy that barely covered the funeral and some outstanding medical bills. I hadn't pushed. I was too busy grieving the only mother figure I actually had, and frankly, I was used to getting nothing from the Dixons. But looking at that gold foil invitation, the pieces clicked together with a sickening precision. The sudden warmth, the nervousness, the exorbitant display of wealth for a wedding that should have been modest. You don't pay for a wedding that looks like a royal coronation with a hardware store salary. You pay for it with found money. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just excluded me from the family that I could handle. They had erased me from Nana Ruth's legacy. They had taken the one thing she intended for me, not just the money, but the validation, the tangible proof that she loved me, and they were using it to throw a party. They were drinking my grandmother's love in champagne flutes. That was the turning point. That was the moment the sadness evaporated and the cold, hard resolve set in. I wasn't going to the wedding to beg for their affection. I wasn't going to sit in the back row and be the difficult sister. I was going to find out exactly how they paid for the aisle runner. I picked up my phone and typed a reply to my mother. "I'll be there." Then I grabbed my keys. I had work to do. I didn't just need a dress. I needed a paper trail. I was going to attend this wedding not to celebrate a union, but to reclaim the truth. And if that truth burned the whole beautiful facade to the ground, so be it. The county clerk's office smelled like floor wax and bureaucratic indifference. It was a scent I knew well from my years as a paralegal, the olfactory backdrop to divorces, property disputes, and the quiet tragedies of public record. I took a ticket from the red dispenser and waited, my eyes scanning the room. I wasn't here as a professional today. I was here as a ghost. When my number was finally called, I approached the glass partition with a practiced neutrality. I requested the probate file for Ruth Elizabeth Dixon. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a cardigan draped over her shoulders, didn't blink. She just tapped at her keyboard, disappeared into the back, and returned 5 minutes later with a thin folder. That was my first red flag. Nana Ruth had owned a home, a car, and had a modest portfolio of stocks she'd held since the 80s. Her file should have been thick with appraisals, inventory lists, and creditor notices. This folder was anorexic. I took the file to a wobbly table in the corner and opened it. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I scanned the documents, my brain switching into work mode, filtering out the emotion to focus on the data. There was the death certificate. There was the appointment of the executor, my father, Calvin Dixon, and then there was the inventory of assets. Total value $12,400. My breath hitched. It was impossible. Nana's house alone was worth $400,000 in this market. I flipped through the pages, hunting for the deed transfer. I found it buried near the back. The house hadn't been sold after her death. It had been transferred 6 weeks before she died. The grantor was Ruth Dixon, represented by her power of attorney, Marianne Dixon. The grantee was a generic LLC registered to a P.O. box in a neighboring county. The sale price was $10. I stared at my mother's signature on the transfer document. It was looped and decorative, a signature designed to look important. She had used the power of attorney meant to pay medical bills and manage affairs if Nana became incapacitated, to liquidate the primary asset for the price of a sandwich. I pulled out my phone and snapped high-resolution photos of every page, my hands shaking so hard I had to brace my elbows on the table. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was theft. But a house transfer wasn't liquid cash. I needed to know where the money went. I needed to trace the liquidity. I left the clerk's office and drove to the public library, the one place where silence was still sacred. Ms. Klein was exactly where I remembered her, behind the reference desk, surrounded by stacks of returns. She was one of the few people in town who hadn't looked at me like a pariah when I was a teenager. I approached her quietly. "Lois," she whispered, pushing her glasses up her nose. "My goodness, I haven't seen you since you left." I kept it brief. I told her I was looking for archived legal notices, specifically regarding trust formations or dissolutions under the name Dixon. She didn't ask why. Librarians are the custodians of secrets. They know that the search for information is usually a search for ammunition. She set me up at a terminal with access to the state's digital archives. It took me 3 hours. My eyes burned from the screen glare, but I found it. A notice to creditors, published 5 years ago for the Ruth Dixon Educational Trust. Nana had set it up quietly, likely when I started community college, hoping to surprise me. Then a second notice dated 2 months prior to her death, dissolution of trust, signed by the trustee Marianne Dixon. The timestamp on the filing coincided with the week Nana had gone into hospice care. They hadn't just waited for her to die. They had started stripping the copper wire out of the walls while she was still breathing. I sat back in the hard library chair, the hum of the ventilation system roaring in my ears. This wasn't just greed. It was a surgical excision of my future. Nana hadn't just left me money. She had left me a ladder to climb out of the hole my parents had dug for me. By stealing it, they weren't just buying a wedding. They were ensuring I stayed in my place. They stole my proof that I mattered. I felt a hot, wet tear slide down my cheek, followed by another. I wiped them away angrily. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. I needed a witness. Paper trails were good, but in a small town, you needed a voice. I drove to the outskirts of town to a small bungalow with a well-tended garden of marigolds. Mrs. Gable had been Nana's best friend for 40 years. They were church ladies, the kind who ran the bake sales and knew exactly whose marriage was on the rocks, based on how they sang the hymns. Mrs. Gable opened the door and her face crumbled when she saw me. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of rosewater and dust. "Oh, Lois," she said, her voice thick. "I knew you'd come. Ruth said you were the smart one." Over tea in her porcelain-cluttered living room, Mrs. Gable filled in the gaps. "Your mother," she said, spitting the word like a curse, "stopped letting me visit the last month. Said Ruth was too tired. But Ruth called me. She had a burner phone she kept in her nightstand. She told me she was scared, Lois. She said Marianne was bringing papers for her to sign, telling her they were for the hospital admission. But Ruth knew. She told me, 'Don't let them take Lois's start. The house precedes the trust, it's for her. She has to get away from them.'" Mrs. Gable went to a sideboard and pulled out a small leather-bound Bible. From between the pages, she extracted a folded piece of stationery. "She wrote this before the stroke. She couldn't mail it because she thought your father checked the outgoing post. She gave it to me at Sunday school." I unfolded the paper. It was a letter addressed to me. "My dearest Lo," it began. "If you're reading this, I've gone to glory. Don't cry too much. I've left things tidy. The trust is yours. The house money is yours. Don't let them bully you. You are the best of us." I stared at the shaky handwriting, the loops of the L exactly as I remembered. This was the smoking gun. Not a legal document, but a moral one. It proved intent. It proved that the POA withdrawal and the trust dissolution were contrary to her wishes. It proved fraud. "Will you stand up and say this?" I asked Mrs. Gable. "If I need you to..." Mrs. Gable straightened her spine. "Marianne Dixon has been walking around this town acting like St. Peter's gatekeeper. I would be delighted to speak the truth." My next stop was Mr. Torres. He was a retired litigator who used to frequent the law firm where I worked. He was a shark in his day, but now he spent his time fishing and drinking iced tea on his porch. I found him there whittling a piece of cedar. I laid it all out for him, the photos of the clerk's files, the printouts from the library, the letter from Mrs. Gable. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes scanning the documents. When I finished, he whistled low and long. "It's clumsy," he said, tapping the deed transfer photo. "Greedy people are usually sloppy. They think the POA is a magic wand. It's not. It's a fiduciary responsibility. Self-dealing is a felony." He looked at me, his expression sharpening. "But you can't just walk in there screaming, Lois. If you go in swinging with emotion, they'll paint you as unstable. That's their defense. You're the crazy daughter imagining things. You need timing. You need receipts. You need to be a lawyer, not a victim." "I want to burn them down," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Good," Torres said. "Use the fire, but control the burn. Do you have proof the money went to the wedding? You have proof it left the estate, but you need the connection. You need to close the loop." He was right. I had the theft, but I needed the spending. The rehearsal dinner was held in the solarium of the Silverleaf estate. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawns. I wore a simple navy dress, blending in, looking like a distant cousin or a vendor. My stomach was a knot of acid. I walked through the main hall, avoiding the guest chatter, moving toward the administrative offices near the kitchens. I knew from my own work that venues often posted the run of show and vendor details near the service entrance. I found a clipboard hanging on the wall outside the catering manager's office. It was the master invoice for the weekend. I scanned the lines: florist, paid in full; catering, paid in full; venue rental, Paid in full. And there clipped to the back was a photocopy of a check. It was standard practice to keep a copy of the final payment on file. The check was for $45,000. The account name in the top left corner wasn't Calvin and Marianne Dixon. It was the R.E. Dixon estate. They hadn't even bothered to launder the money through their personal accounts. They had written a check directly from Nana's estate account, the one that was supposed to be empty to pay for the venue. They were literally standing on Nana's grave to toast the bride. I snapped a picture of the check. That was it. The loop was closed. I slipped my phone back into my purse and walked toward the solarium. The air inside was thick with laughter and the clink of silverware. I saw them immediately. My father standing near the bar looking red-faced and jovial. Hannah in a white cocktail dress looking radiant and terrified. And Mom. She was holding court at the head table, gesturing with a wine glass, her laugh tinkling like broken glass. I walked in. The room didn't go silent, but the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in my immediate vicinity. Heads turned. Whispers started. Is that Lois? I thought she wasn't coming. Mom saw me. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes went dead. She excused herself and intercepted me near the buffet line. She smelled of expensive perfume and Chardonnay. You came, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I got the invite, I said, keeping my face blank. I wouldn't miss it. Look, she hissed, leaning in close so it looked like an affectionate mother-daughter moment. I don't know what you're doing here, but if you make a scene, I will have security escort you out. This is Hannah's weekend. You always wanted attention, Lois. Even as a little girl, you couldn't stand it if the sun wasn't shining on you. I don't want attention, Mom, I said calmly. I just want to see my sister get married. We took you in when you were difficult, she whispered, her nails digging into my forearm. We protected you. Don't you forget that. You owe us your silence. She walked away, leaving red crescents on my skin. I stood there breathing through the rage. We protected you. The audacity was breathtaking. I found Hannah near the dessert table. She looked up, her eyes widening. Lois, you made it. She hugged me, but it was stiff. She was trembling. Mom said you probably wouldn't come. She said you were going through an episode. I'm fine, Hannah, I said, pulling back. You look beautiful. Please, Hannah whispered, looking over her shoulder at Mom. Just don't fight with her. Not this weekend. I just want everything to be perfect. Mom's been so stressed about the money. I mean, the planning. The money? I asked gently. Yeah, just making sure everything is paid for. She said Dad had to pull some strings. Hannah looked at me with genuine, naive eyes. She didn't know. She truly believed the fairy tale. She was the golden child protected by a wall of lies that I was about to sledgehammer. I'm just so glad you're here. Maybe we can finally be a real family again. I looked at her, and for a second I wavered. Maybe I should just leave. Maybe I should let her have this lie. But then I looked across the room and saw my father laughing with Evan, the fiancé. I saw the opulent centerpieces. I felt the phantom weight of Nana's letter in my purse. I retreated to the bathroom to compose myself. I needed a moment of quiet. I sat in the stall, scrolling through the photos on my phone, organizing them into a folder, probate deed check invoice. I was readying the ammunition. Just as I was about to unlock the stall door, the main door opened. 2 women walked in. I recognized the voices. One was my mother, the other was her sister, Aunt Sarah, the one I had been sent to live with. Is she acting up? Aunt Sarah asked. Not yet. Mom sighed. But she's here, stalking around like a vulture. God, I hate looking at her. She looks just like Ruth. Well, Sarah said, the sound of a compact snapping shut echoing in the tile room. At least she doesn't know. As long as she thinks she was sent away because she was troubled, she'll keep her head down. Guilt is a powerful leash, Marianne. It was genius. Mom laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. Telling everyone she was stealing from us. Telling the church she had kleptomania and behavioral issues, it covered up why we really sent her away. Because she saw the bank statements, Sarah finished. She was 12, but she was sharp. She saw you dipping into the college fund. We had to get rid of the witness. I froze, my breath trapped in my throat. My entire body went cold. Exactly, Mom said. And it worked. Everyone pities us for having such a difficult daughter. And now, thanks to Ruth's generosity, the slate is clean. We get the money and Lois gets the shame. It's poetic, really. They laughed. They washed their hands and left the bathroom. I sat there in the silence, the motion sensor light flickering off, plunging me into semi-darkness. The realization washed over me like ice water. The family incident. The reason I was sent away. It wasn't because I was bad. It wasn't because I was difficult. It was because at 12 years old I had asked a question about a bank statement I found on the counter. I had forgotten that memory, buried it under years of gaslighting. They had framed a child. They had branded me a thief and a problem to the entire community to cover their own embezzlement. They didn't just steal my inheritance. They stole my reputation. They stole my childhood to protect their greed. The wavering was gone. The desire for a simple justice was gone. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about exorcism. I wasn't just going to present a legal case. I was going to dismantle their entire reality. I walked out of the bathroom. I went to my car and grabbed the manila envelope. I called Mr. Torres. I'm ready, I said. Send the draft demand letter to my email. I'm printing everything tonight. Did you find the link? He asked. I found everything. I said, my voice steady, cold, and absolutely clear. They didn't just spend the money, Mr. Torres. They spent my life. I drove back to my motel, the neon sign buzzing overhead. I laid the documents out on the bedspread. The probate fraud, the forged deed, the check to Silverleaf, the letter from Nana, and now the knowledge of the original sin. I organized them into packets. One for Evan, one for the venue coordinator, one for the pastor, and the master copy for me. I checked the time. The wedding ceremony was in 14 hours. I set my alarm. I wasn't going to sleep, but I laid down anyway, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the lines in my head. I didn't come to ruin a wedding. I came to stop a lie. Tomorrow, when the minister asked if anyone had just cause why these two should not be joined, I wouldn't object to the marriage. I would object to the funding. I would object to the fiction. I would stand up and I would make sure that when the truth came out, it didn't just whisper. It would scream. The wedding day dawned with a brilliance that felt like a personal insult. The Silverleaf estate was transformed into a spectacle of American aristocracy. A string quartet played beneath a trellis choked with white roses. Guests arrived in a parade of pastel silk and linen, cooing over the custom calligraphy on the welcome sign and the champagne wall that greeted them at the entrance. It was flawless. It was curated. It was rotting from the inside out. I sat in the back row during the ceremony, a ghost in a navy dress, watching my sister exchange vows that were paid for with a dead woman's legacy. I watched my mother dab a dry eye with a lace handkerchief, performing the role of the proud matriarch so well she probably believed it herself. My father stood tall, his chest puffed out, the very image of a man who provided. The cognitive dissonance made me nauseous. I wasn't just watching a wedding. I was watching a money laundering operation dressed up in tulle. The reception was held in the grand ballroom, a cavernous space of crystal chandeliers and gold leaf molding. I was seated at table 19, the Exiled table tucked near the kitchen doors, along with a few second cousins and the wedding photographer's assistant. The centerpiece alone, a towering arrangement of orchids and hydrangeas, probably cost more than the first car I bought. I didn't eat. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the manila envelope resting on my knees under the tablecloth. The air was thick with the smell of filet mignon, an expensive perfume, but all I could smell was the sulfur of impending destruction. The speeches began after the main course. The best man told a frat story. The maid of honor cried through a poem. Then the DJ lowered the music and asked if anyone else wanted to say a few words. The room was warm, happy drunk on open-bar generosity. This was the moment. I stood up. My mother saw me first. She was at the head table, a glass of wine halfway to her lips. She froze. Her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a terrifying sharp command. She shook her head, a microscopic violent motion. "Sit down." My father half rose from his chair, his face flushing a dangerous red. "Lois," he mouthed, "not today." But I was already walking toward the dance floor. Hannah intercepted me near the cake table. She looked frantic, her veil slightly askew. "Lois, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom said you were upset. Just go sit down. Why can't you just be happy for me for once? Why do you have to ruin everything?" That was the trigger, the final cut. Why can't you be happy for me, as if my existence was a deliberate act of sabotage against her joy? She truly believed that I was the villain of this story, that my trauma was just an inconvenience to her spotlight. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the willful ignorance in her eyes. She chose not to know. "I am happy for you, Hannah," I said, my voice quiet. "That's why I'm doing this." I walked past her and took the microphone from the DJ's stand. He looked confused, but yielded. The room quieted down, the clatter of silverware fading into a curious silence. I stood in the center of the spotlight, the manila envelope in my hand. I didn't look crazy. I didn't look drunk. I looked like a sister about to give a toast. "Hi, everyone," I began, my voice steady, amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system. "For those who don't know me, I'm Lois, Hannah's sister." A ripple of polite applause. Mom was signaling the venue coordinator, making a cut-it motion across her throat. I had about 90 seconds. "I wanted to talk about our grandmother, Ruth Dixon," I continued, keeping my tone warm, almost nostalgic. "Nana Ruth couldn't be here today, but she's here in spirit, and as it turns out, she's here in other ways too. Nana Ruth taught me about fairness. She taught me that the truth matters even when it's inconvenient. She valued community and integrity." I saw Evan the groom smiling politely. He was a good guy. He valued integrity. This was for him too. "Nana Ruth also believed in independence," I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. "She worked her whole life to build something to leave behind. She wanted her legacy to be a shield for her family, not a slush fund." The room temperature dropped. The polite smiles faltered. "I'm standing here because I can't let her be used like a credit card after she's gone," I said, opening the envelope. "This wedding is beautiful. It is perfect. And it is entirely paid for with money stolen from the estate of Ruth Dixon." A gasp rippled through the room. Not a loud one, but a sharp intake of breath. My mother stood up, knocking her chair over. "Cut the mic," she screamed. "She's having an episode, cut the mic." I didn't need the mic anymore. I projected my voice clear and ringing in the sudden silence. "I have the receipts. October 14th. A deed transfer of Nana's home for $10 signed by Marianne Dixon, using a power of attorney while Nana was incapacitated. November 2nd. The liquidation of the Ruth Dixon Educational Trust, unrelated to any medical costs. And finally, I pulled out the photo of the check enlarged on a piece of cardstock. A check written directly from the R.E. Dixon estate to Silverleaf Manor for $45,000. I held it up. This wedding wasn't paid for by my parents' generosity. It was paid for by the inheritance my grandmother left to me, the inheritance they hid. "Liar!" Mom shrieked, rushing toward the dance floor. "She's sick. She's always been jealous of Hannah. Don't listen to her." Dad was right behind her, his face purple. "Security! Get her out of here!" Evan stood up. He looked pale. "Wait," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the room. "Let her finish." "Evan, she's lying," Mom pleaded, grabbing his arm. "She's mentally unstable. We've been dealing with this since she was a child." "Since I was a child?" I asked, looking directly at Evan. "Since the family incident? You mean when I found the bank statements when I was 12? When you sent me away to cover up the fact that you were dipping into the college funds back then, too?" That's enough, Dad roared, lunging for me. I took a step back and played my ace. I don't expect you to take my word for it, I said. I know the narrative. I'm the difficult one. I'm the problem. So don't listen to me. Listen to Marianne. I pulled my phone from my pocket, connected via Bluetooth to the sound system which the stunned DJ hadn't disconnected. I hit play. The recording from the bathroom yesterday boomed through the speakers, crisp and undeniable. It was genius, telling everyone she was stealing from us, telling the church she had kleptomania. It covered up why we really sent her away, because she saw the bank statements. We had to get rid of the witness. We get the money and Lois gets the shame. It's poetic, really. The audio cut off. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and total. My mother froze mid-step, her face, usually so composed, fractured. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She looked around the room, seeing the horror on the faces of her friends, her pastor, her community. There was no spinning this. Her own voice had just convicted her. Marianne. Dad whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at her, then at the floor, collapsing into his chair, as if his strings had been cut. He was complicit, but he was weak. He knew it was over. I looked at Hannah. She was standing perfectly still, her hands covering her mouth. Her eyes were darting from Mom to me, and I saw the moment her world split open. The golden child, the protected princess, realized she was standing on a foundation of rot. She realized that every nice thing she owned, every advantage she had, was stolen from the sister she had been taught to pity. She looked at me, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see a rival. She saw a victim. You knew, Hannah whispered to Mom. You told me she was crazy. You told me she stole. Hannah, baby, it's complicated, Mom stammered, reaching for her. We did it for us, for the family. No, Evan said. He stepped away from Mom, putting physical distance between himself and the Dixon parents. He looked at the enlarged check I was still holding. He looked at the legal preservation notice I had just placed on the table next to the cake. The venue coordinator, a sharp woman in a black blazer, stepped forward. I had handed her a packet 5 minutes before I took the mic. Mrs. Dixon, she said, her voice professional and icy. We have received a legal notice regarding the funds used for this event. We will be freezing all vendor records and cooperating with the forensic accounting request. It was the final nail. The fantasy was dead. The wedding was a crime scene. Mom screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a guttural sound of pure rage and humiliation. After all we did for you, she yelled at me, her face twisted into something ugly. You ungrateful little brat. We gave you life. You gave me a life sentence, I corrected her, my voice calm, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold clarity. And today, I commuted it. I didn't wait for security. I didn't wait for the applause or the booze. There would be neither. There was only shock. I walked over to Evan. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down. I handed him the manila envelope containing the full evidence, the probate records, Nana's letter, the bathroom transcript. I'm sorry, Evan, I said. I truly am. But you're a good man. You deserve to know who you're marrying into. I looked at Hannah one last time. She was sobbing now, not the pretty tears of a bride, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone grieving a reality that never existed. I'm not asking you to believe me because I'm hurt, I said to the room, though my eyes were on my sister. I'm asking you to read. I placed the microphone on the table. It rolled slightly, the thud echoing in the silence. Then I turned my back on the head table, on the flowers, on the parents who had sold me for parts, and I walked out of the ballroom. I walked through the lobby, past the terrified valet, and out into the cool night air. My hands were shaking, but my head was high. I had come to stop a lie, and the silence behind me told me I had done exactly that. The walk from the ballroom to the parking lot felt like moving through deep water. Behind me, the hum of the reception had disintegrated into a chaotic frequency of hushed whispers, the clatter of dropped cutlery, and the distinct jarring sound of a chair being shoved violently across a parquet floor. I didn't look back, but I could feel the eyes of 200 guests boring into my spine. The perfect day hadn't just ended, it had dissolved. I could hear the murmur of voices rising, the sharp, distinctive tone of people sharing shock. And worse for my mother, the collective judgment of a small town that finally had the proof it had suspected for years. I reached my rental car, my hand trembling so badly, I dropped the keys twice before I could unlock the door. I hadn't even started the engine when the ballroom doors flew open. Hannah stumbled out, her veil torn at the comb trailing behind her like a broken wing. She wasn't running to catch me. She was running to escape the suffocation of the room. When she saw me, she stopped. Her face was a ruin of mascara and blotchy red anger. She marched toward the car, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You ruined my life!" she screamed, the sound raw and tearing in the cool night air. "Are you happy now? You destroyed everything. Evan won't even look at me." I rolled down the window, keeping the door locked. "I didn't ruin your life, Hannah," I said, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "I told the truth. There's a difference." "You could have waited," she sobbed, slapping her palms against the driver's side door. "You could have done this privately. Why did you have to humiliate us?" "Because privately, you would have let them bury me," I said. "You would have taken the money, believed the lie, and let me be the villain forever. I didn't have a choice." She stared at me, her chest heaving, searching for a rebuttal that didn't exist. Then she turned and ran back toward the lodge, not inside but toward the gardens, disappearing into the dark. I watched her go, feeling a pang of nausea. It wasn't triumph, it was just inevitable. I didn't stay to watch the rest, but the updates came quickly. In the digital age, scandals travel faster than light. By the time I was back in my motel room, scrubbing the makeup off my face with a rough washcloth, the texts were rolling in. Mrs. Gable, my grandmother's friend, texted me. "Evan sent the minister home." The music stopped. "Your mother is trying to tell people it's a deepfake recording, but no one is buying it. We remember Ruth. That was the key." My mother's attempt at damage control was immediate and desperate. She tried to spin the narrative, telling the remaining guests that I was off my medication, that the documents were forged, that the recording was manipulated. But the community isn't stupid. They knew Nana Ruth. They remembered the sudden change in her will, the closed-door estate sale, the way the Dixons had suddenly upgraded their cars, the month after the funeral. My receipts didn't just expose a crime. They validated the town's collective memory. The respectable facade my mother had polished for decades had shattered, and no amount of PR spin could glue it back together. Evan Miller was the first domino to fall. I heard later from Mr. Torres that Evan had asked his parents to take him home. He didn't break up with Hannah on the spot, he was too decent for that, but he postponed the signing of the marriage license. He told my father he couldn't legally attach himself to a family under investigation for fraud until the books were cleared. It was a decision made of integrity, which must have burned my father more than any insult. The Millers were a family that valued honor. The Dixons were a family that valued optics. The collision was fatal to the wedding. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the wall. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt lighter. Instead, I felt a crushing weight of loneliness. My hands were still shaking, a physiological reaction to the adrenaline crash. I had done it. I had cleared my name. But in doing so, I had orphaned myself completely. There was no going back for Christmas now. There were no awkward but civil phone calls in my future. I had burned the bridge, the river, and the land on the other side. I called Mr. Torres. "It's done," I said. "I heard," he replied, his voice gruff but kind. "The librarian told me. Said it was surgical." "I feel sick," I admitted, curling my legs up to my chest. "Is that normal?" "Freedom isn't free, Lois," he said gently. "You just bought your life back, but the currency for that kind of freedom is usually loneliness. At least for a while. You're grieving the family you wanted, not the one you had. Let yourself grieve. The next morning, the legal pressure tightened. Mr. Torres had filed the formal demand for accounting at 9:00 a.m. sharp. By 10:00 a.m., my phone rang. It was my father. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again. Finally, I picked up. "Lois," he said. He sounded 20 years older. There was no bluster left, just a terrified exhaustion. "We need to talk, without lawyers." "No," I said. "Listen to me," he pleaded. "We can work this out. We can sell the boat. We can liquidate some assets. We can pay you back. We'll give you 50,000. Just withdraw the demand. Please. If this goes to a forensic audit, your mother, she could go to jail, Lois." "She committed a felony," I said, my voice flat. "And you helped her." "I was trying to keep the peace," he cracked. "I just wanted everyone happy." "You wanted everyone happy except me," I corrected him. "You're offering me hush money, Dad. You're trying to buy my silence again, but the price has gone up." "What do you want?" he asked, desperate. "Name the number." "I don't want a number," I said. "I want what was meant for me. I want the full amount of the trust, the full proceeds from the house, and I want it documented. And I want a written admission, not a private deal, a public filing." "You're destroying us," he whispered. "No, Dad," I said, looking out the window at the parking lot where my rental car sat packed and ready to go. "I'm just refusing to let you destroy me anymore." I hung up. I blocked his number. Then I picked up my bag and walked out of the room. The air outside smelled like rain and gasoline, but for the first time in my life, it didn't smell like fear. It smelled like the truth. Justice, I learned, does not look like a lightning bolt. It looks like paperwork. It looks like endless emails, certified letters, and the slow, grinding friction of the civil court system. In the movies, the villain confesses, the hero gets a check, and the credits roll. In real life, the money didn't magically reappear in my bank account the Monday after the wedding. It took 6 months just to untangle the knot my parents had tied. The forensic accounting revealed a spider web of transfers, withdrawals, and debts that went far deeper than just the wedding. My parents hadn't just stolen from Nana. They had been living beyond their means for decades, using the family reputation as collateral for loans they couldn't pay. When the truth came out, the creditors circled like sharks in the water. The Silverleaf estate sued for breach of contract and fraud to recoup their losses, forcing my parents to list their own home, the house I was kicked out of as a child, to cover the legal crater they had blasted into their lives. But while the money was slow, the vindication was instant. The silence that had defined my life, the heavy blanket of shame I had been forced to wear, was gone. The town knew, the church knew. My phone didn't ring with invitations to Sunday dinner, but it also didn't ring with accusations. I walked down the street in my old neighborhood to meet Mr. Torres for coffee, and people didn't look away. They nodded. Some even stopped to apologize, mumbling about how they had no idea and how Ruth would be proud. I didn't need their apologies, but I took them. They were the interest payments on the truth I had finally withdrawn. Hannah showed up at my apartment door on a Tuesday evening in November. She looked thinner, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the curated outfits she used to post online. She didn't have a ring on her finger. She stood in the hallway looking at the scuff marks on the floor, unable to meet my eyes. "We postponed it indefinitely," she said, her voice brittle. "Evan said he couldn't marry into a lie. We're going to therapy. Separately." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. I didn't invite her in. That was a boundary I had drawn in permanent marker. "I'm sorry it hurts, Hannah. I really am." She looked up then, and I saw the flash of the old anger, the reflex to blame me. "You could have warned me," she said. "You let me walk into that room like a lamb to the slaughter." "I tried to warn you for years," I said softly. "You just covered your ears because the music was playing too loud. You liked the life they gave you too much to ask where the money came from." She flinched. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but then she closed it. The reality of the last 6 months, the foreclosure signs, the depositions, the shame had finally pierced the bubble. "I miss them," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I miss when we were happy, even if it was fake." "I know," I said, "but I can't mourn a fantasy." "Can we fix this?" she asked. "Can we be sisters?" I looked at her. I saw the sister I had wanted to play with as a child, and the stranger who had watched me get sent away without a word of protest. "I can love you, Hannah," I said, and I meant it. "But I don't trust you, and I don't know if I ever will. Trust is expensive. You have to earn it back, and it takes a long time." She nodded, wiping her face. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't a hug, but it was honest. She turned and walked down the hallway, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to chase her. The settlement was finalized a week before Christmas. It wasn't the fortune Nana had originally left, legal fees, and the venue's clawback had eaten a significant chunk, but it was enough. It was enough to pay off my car. It was enough to buy a small house with a porch. But I didn't want to just absorb the money. That money was blood money in a way. It was the cost of my trauma. I wanted to transmute it into something that couldn't be stolen. I drove out to the cemetery on a gray, crisp afternoon. Nana Ruth's grave was simple, a granite marker under an old oak tree. I brushed a few dead leaves off the stone. "I did it, Nana," I said to the wind. "I stopped them." I had already met with Mr. Torres that morning to sign the papers for the new project. I wasn't keeping the bulk of the settlement. I was using it to seed the Ruth Dixon Legal Defense Fund. It would be a small, specific grant designed to provide legal aid for seniors in our county who were vulnerable to financial abuse and power of attorney fraud. It was a shield. I was going to make sure that the next time a greedy relative tried to erase a grandmother's legacy, there would be a lawyer standing at the gate ready to bite back. I stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at my cheeks. I thought about the little girl with the packed bag by the door. I thought about the teenager counting tips to pay for textbooks. I thought about the woman who stood alone on a dance floor and burned her family's lies to the ground. I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't the secret. I turned my back on the grave, not in disrespect, but in completion. I walked back to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, a sound that felt solid and real. I had paid a high price for this piece, but as I unlocked the door and sat in the driver's seat, I realized it was a bargain. I wasn't saved by revenge. I was saved by the choice to value myself when no one else would. I started the engine and drove out of the cemetery gates, leaving the ghosts behind me. I wasn't born to be their secret. I was born to be free. And so Lois Dixon finally earned the peace her grandmother had promised her, not through forgiveness, but through a reckoning that severed the painful ties of her past. What did you think of Lois's final calculated move? Did she get the justice she deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more content. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.